As I've gone through the first 5 weeks so far, there were a number of places in there where I used our family and the kids' ministry, the Grand Family Singers, as examples. I have just a couple comments on that before we move on. With the kids, I know it sounded like they're out of ministry, and that may conflict with the fact that I'm stressing you need to be training your kids in that. And it may sound like all of a sudden I'm telling you to do this and then we've stopped. And I want to make sure you didn't get that impression. The kids are still singing, and we were easing back into working back towards that full-time situation that we were kind of in before. And as the problems I talked to you about, as those begin to work themselves out, we're getting back to that. So they are singing. Right now they're doing a lot of things like nursing homes and retirement centers and assisted living type things, and they're doing a lot of that type of ministry. Plus they're doing some churches locally. We were just in a church, a week ago. We're at this point just basically local. In other words, basically if I can get there and back on a tank of gas, then we'll do it. If it's something where we're going to have to be gone for a week, typically we're not going to do that. We will be going to Tulsa with Norm for about a week. That's going to be about the biggest thing we've done since 2 Octobers ago. And so that's just another step in kind of easing back towards that. But we are working towards that, and that's what you want to do. I mentioned a lot of that in the fact that if you get your kids in ministry as children, you're going to be facing that transition. And I just want to let you know, it's not easy. It can be tough. Then again, it might be easy. Maybe your child makes that transition very easily. Our 4 didn't, and they're having a hard time with it. The other thing I want to make sure you do is make sure that you see those things as examples of just one possible scenario out of hundreds of thousands of scenarios. In other words, God's not going to do the same thing with you and your kids that he did with the Grahams and our kids. Your situation is going to look entirely different. So I presented those things as examples of just one possible type of thing. It's our experience. It's something that I know about because I've lived it, and so I can give that as an example. And I want to make sure you take it as that and don't see what we've done as a pattern or a prototype that you need to duplicate. The reason I'm cautioning you on that is we actually have had families that have looked at what we've been doing with our children and then tried to duplicate that with their kids, making their kids take piano, making their kids sing, making their kids go through the process that our kids went through. And I just want to make sure you don't do that unless you're absolutely sure God's saying do that. It will be a disaster for your children. You understand there are not very many family groups out there that are out there in music ministry. I gave you example of the Dardens, who were, a family of girls younger than our kids. Obviously, that's where they're going. You got big name families that you maybe have, like the Crabb family. I think the Isaacs, McCameys. You got some family singing groups out there, but when you look at the total number of Christian families out there and then look at the number of them that are in music ministry, as a percentage, it's so small it's not even worth talking about. And so the likelihood that God's going to take your family the way he took our family, it's possible, but not very probable. Statistically speaking, it probably isn't going to happen. So look at things that I've given you as just an example of the type of thing that you can expect as you go down the road. We spent 5 weeks talking about train up a child in the way he should go. As he grows old, he will not depart from it. There's a lot to that verse, isn't there? I mean, you wouldn't think so on the surface, but we spent 5 weeks just on basically everything that can be involved in that verse in actually getting from point A to point B. And it's not easy, it's hard, it takes sacrifice and all that kind of stuff. And I just gave our family as an example of how that might look. You have to figure out how that's going to look for you and your kids. Going on from there, I'm going to be talking about another little fun thing here that you will see with your kids. And this is the idea of this left brain, right brain thing. The left brain tends to be the part of your brain that is the logical side. It's the analysis side. It takes information coming in and it analyzes it and it just figures out logically what to do. It gets involved in this way's better than that way or those kinds of things. Logical yes-no type answers. A lot of the information coming into your brain, as it first comes into the brain, comes in on the right side. The right side is the first side of the brain to see information coming, for instance, from your ears and from your eyes and your senses. It goes into the right brain first. Then that gets passed over to the left brain, and the left brain kind of makes decisions about it. It's the decision-making side of the mind. It decides what it's going to do with that information and how it's going to interpret that. The right side is the abstract side. It just takes information in and it just gets it in, but it doesn't do a lot of analysis on it. It just absorbs the information. It's from the right side of the brain. If you're a very creative type person, it's that side of the brain that is really involved in that. The left side is not real creative. It's just, that's the way it is. Now, in our society, and this is the society we live in the United States and Europe, men tend to be left-brained. Most of us guys operate off this side. This side doesn't do a whole lot. It's just sitting over there. It gets the information, shoves it to the left, and then that's where it's dealt with. Women tend to be more on the right side. Now, does that mean we don't have left-brained women? Oh, yeah. Yeah, we do. We got one in our family. And you can have right-brained men who tend to be predominantly right-brained. One of the things I want to show you here is typically you'll see this kind of a scenario. It's kind of like a teeter-totter situation. And let's just say this is the left and this is the right. So if you've got a man over here who's left brain, typically you're going to find he's not real strong in the right brain stuff. And then with the woman who's very strong in the right brain, typically she's not really strong in the left brain things, okay? If you only had to choose between these two scenarios, which one of those is the best one to have? The men are going to say, well, this one. And the women are going to say, no, it's the other one. Well, it's whichever one you got, of course, that's the best one to have, right? Actually, neither one is really best. You do understand that God uses both kinds of people. If you have a left-brained man, what kind of woman does he normally, and not always, but normally end up with? The right brain, yeah. You got to remember that unlikes attract and likes repel. Now, it doesn't always work that way, but just statistically speaking, typically that's the way it comes out. Let me ask you this. Which one of these do you think Yahweh has? In other words, you understand that he's up there like that, right? Which one of these scenarios do you think Adam and Eve were? Let me give you a hint. God created them in his image. I don't believe Adam and Eve were either one of these. I think they were just like this, because they were created in God's image. And God, he's very strong on both sides. Adam and Eve were very strong on both sides. We come from Adam and Eve, so the question is do we have the ability to operate like that? Absolutely. And so what you can do, and we know this, we know that you can take a person who's low over here on the left side and you can bring that up, and so that you end up with this moving up here. Let me give you something that's been going on in our public schools. If you want to do some research on the internet, this is really interesting. We now have a situation because women were very low on the left side, and our society, guess which one of these our society puts the greatest amount of importance on? This is not very important. If you're going to cut programs in schools, guess what's going to get cut? It's the arts, the creative stuff, right? We put a large amount of emphasis over here. So, guess what? A few years back, society was looking and they were saying, you know what? We got a bunch of girls that they're just not there when it comes to science and math and all these kind of things. And so you know what we began to do in a lot of schools? We began to really focus on girls, and we create a lot of girls programs focused on math and science and left brain type stuff. And so now guess what they're beginning to find out? All our colleges that deal in the math and sciences today are, guess what? Predominantly female. The men aren't there. Because while we were focusing on the girls, we were pulling resources from here. And so now what we have developing in the United States is a society where the women are primarily left-brained and the men are primarily right-brained. Society has done a flip on us, and they're now seeing this in some of the colleges. That's why you notice when I stressed, in our society, men tend to be left and women tend to be right in our society. But if things keep going the way they are, our society in another 5 or 10 years won't be that society. It'll be just the opposite. So where does this play in when you're training your children? Well, real simple. If you've got a real strong left-brained guy, you can work on bringing up that right-brain stuff. But what do you got to be very careful of? Don't start focusing on the right brain stuff at the cost of the left brain stuff, or he's going to teeter-totter on you. And now you're going to have the same problem only in reverse. And remember, neither one of these scenarios is better or worse than the other. So if you do take that left-brained male child and turn him into a right-brained male child, is that necessarily bad? Well, it's not any better or worse than the situation you had before. You've just put a lot of energy and effort into flipping the teeter-totter, but you're not in a better situation. In order to end up in the better situation, you have to take that left-brained male and prop this side up, and then take this and bring it up so that you end up with this scenario. That is the only way you can improve on the situation. Other than that, you're just changing the situation. Does that make sense? You're just simply changing it. And you don't end up with any situations better or worse, because God's going to be able to use that child whether they're left or whether they're right. God doesn't really care. He'll use both. But if you want to improve it so that that child now becomes useful in both left brain situations and right brain situations, you've got to boost the weak end without letting the other end drop. And that is exactly what we've done in our school systems over the last 20 years. And now that's beginning to become apparent. Not that that's necessarily, in my opinion, necessarily a bad thing. It's just that now we got girls that are left-brained and guys that are right-brained. Big deal. So what? Now we're different. Not necessarily better or not necessarily worse. So watch for that kind of stuff with your kids. If you don't feel comfortable in boosting that low side, then just leave it the way it is. God will use them regardless. But some people do like to kind of work on that. They kind of get concerned that their girls aren't good at math and science, and they get a little bit concerned that the boys are too much into trucks and not enough into cooking. And you can build that low side. Travis is a left-brain guy who likes doing creative things. He's not extremely left-brain, in other words. Edie's been working with him on cooking. He just did what do you call that thing? A dinner party where he was required, all the kids have to do this, but he was required to actually put together the whole party, cook the food, buy the food, do the whole thing from scratch. And then we had a few people over, and we did a whole night, but it was his deal. And that's very definitely working on this end over here, pulling that up, but yet not forgetting the other side. All right, let's switch gears just a little bit. How many of you have heard of the 3 R's? Yeah, we say reading, writing, and arithmetic. Reading, writing, and math is basically what those 3 are. Actually, I believe there's 4, and there should be 4. There's reading, writing, arithmetic, and rhythm. Otherwise, reading, writing, math, and music. The R, the W, and the 2 M's. Music is really very important. Only in recent years has music become relatively unimportant in our society. We still have a lot of societies where music is very important. And in all societies up until the last 100 years, music was extremely important in all societies. If you read through the Torah, guess what? You find just tons of references to what? Music. The people were very into music. And I'm going to show you in a minute how they were probably into that. I want to read to you a little blurb of something I got off of the internet. I actually ran across this when I was researching Roman history for another talk I do on Nicolaitans. But I ran into this, and so I pulled this out of that talk and put it in this one because it actually works here. It has to do with early cultures and the importance of music. And it says, Roman life was pervaded by music in all aspects. Evidence shows that music was central to Roman religious ceremony, civic activity, entertainment, the military, and the culture of work as early as the era of the kings. Now that means the kings were prior to Julius Caesar and the emperors, while they were still a representative republic. Roman music was definitely formed by many foreign influences. In other words, Rome would go conquer, and they incorporated those people into the Roman society. And so along with it came a lot of cultural values, a lot of music, and all that. So Roman music, for instance, by the time you get even to the time of Christ, which is the early emperors, their music was just very rich. It had all these cultural influences in it. They had absorbed from all the different cultures that they had taken over. And of course that continued throughout the whole time that the Roman Empire was kind of in charge of the world. And so music was very central to them. Now, anybody in these cultures who had any culture understood music. And when I say they understood music, I mean they were educated in music. They knew music theory. They understood what music was all about. It was a couple months ago when we went to the Colorado Symphony, and they do things for school kids. It was the rehearsal. You can take schools and homeschool parents can take their kids for a little bit of nothing, and you get to go through the dress rehearsal, which is as good as an actual concert. And it's their final one last run through before they do it for the audience at large, where it costs you like $100 to go see it, and you can get in for the dress rehearsal for like $5. So we went, and one of the things they do is before that happens, they will a lot of times get the people into a room and they'll have a lecturer come in and give a lecture. And it was very interesting that this guy was talking about classical music. And this is the way it was back in Rome and all through the early ancient history. He was talking in reference to classical music, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, and those kind of guys. But this is the way it had always been. But he made the point that when you went to one of those concerts back in those days, you went as a very educated person musically. You understood music. You had to. Because when you went to that concert and you heard that new piece by Mozart, you would never hear it again. These composers wrote their pieces, they put them together, and they performed them. And then they started work on their next piece. And if you missed the performance, then you missed. And only the people who were at that performance ever got to hear it. So when you went to a concert, you were listening from a very educated point of view because you wanted to get as much out of that as possible, because you were not going to go out of that door like we do today, stop by the product table, buy a CD of the performance, take it home, put it on your CD player, and listen to it whenever you wanted to. You understand that did not happen? That is a recent development in history. That has only been possible within the last 100 years. Prior to that, that never happened. So people had to really know music in order to really enjoy it because they only got one shot at it. And so they needed to get as much out as possible. And this gentleman with the Colorado Symphony was making that point about people during the classical period of those classical writers, how they were very musically adept. They really understood music, like very few people today do. And he was saying what made the difference was technology. It was when the record player came out and the ability to take the music home and listen to it, that people began to not become educated in music because they could go home and listen to it over and over and over and over again. And after listening to it 100 times, it begins to sink. But before the record player and the tape recorder, You went to a concert and you had one shot. It would never be repeated. It was a one-time deal. And so you had to really understand music. So I want to talk a little bit about music and a little bit about the history of music and where it's gone, and hopefully make a case for making sure that not only are your kids able to read and write and do math, which are very important, but I'm hopefully going to make a case here that music is just as important as those three, if maybe not more important. I want to look at basically music in the church. And music in the church in the United States European culture basically started during the classical period. These writers that we now call classical music, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and those guys, most of their music was written for the church. It was church music. And all those guys did that. It was the church, and we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church, was basically who they wrote their music for. It was music to be played in church. So you start out with everything classical, church music. People understood it. They were trained in it. They knew what was going on musically when they went and listened to that music in the church or wherever it was. A little later now, we're into like the 1800s, we start getting into gospel music, which now is also church music, but it's not classical. It's more like the stuff we do today, but it's not like what we do today. It was early gospel music. Early gospel music is unlike anything that's done in any church today. It's just totally different. But it began music being in the church, and believe it or not, this is the first time you actually find people in the congregation participating in the music themselves. Up until this time, music was always written by the writer, it was performed, and the people listened. If you didn't have an instrument or you weren't actually part of the performance, then you just observed. When we get to early gospel music in the 1800s, we begin to find now that people, the congregation, are actually participating in the music. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but there were a lot of churches where that was terrible. You had people who would actually go out and sit on the lawn in the summer during the song service because this was so sinful to actually be participating in the service. They couldn't believe it. And so they refused to put up with it, and they would not attend that part of the service. One of the things that came in at this time was something called shape note singing. What it was is you all know the do, re, mi. They would give a shape to each one of those. Do would be one shape, and re would be another one, and la is another, and sol is another. And I remember sol is a circle. And I always thought, well, sol is like the sun. You got triangles, you got squares, you got circles, you got diamonds. Each one is a different shape. And so there's only like 7 or 8 of those. And so what people would do is they would print the music, and instead of all the notes being round, the notes would have a shape that would correspond to its tone. And so people in the audience who were participating knew which part. They knew whether their part was the top one, the second line, third line, or the fourth line. And then they knew for each shape, all they had to learn was what sound to make went with what shape. And since there weren't very many, it didn't take a genius to figure this out. And so they could actually take music and hand the congregation a piece of printed music that they had never seen before, and the people could sing it right off in perfect, beautiful 4-part harmony because they simply were singing the shapes. They knew what sound went with the shape on their line. And that was the way it was in the churches, especially down south. That's the way it was until something happened, and it was called technology. And we started coming out in the late 40s, early 50s with recording, the ability to actually record sound and play it back in our homes at will. And what then began to happen is the shape notes went away, and we came out with the traditional, all of you've seen traditional hymn books. And if you notice, all the music in there all the notes are round. So if you don't know a little bit about music, you have trouble with the 4-part harmony, singing that stuff, because you got to know music to do that. The Shapes made it so you could do that and not really be musically literate. And so they had beautiful 4-part harmony going on. Then we come into the hymn book era, and we begin to find, as we begin to go from the original records into long play record albums and stereophonic hi-fi and really good quality sound, that we begin to find that people no longer know how to sing 4-part harmony. By and large, most people in most churches today couldn't do, if you handed them a hymn book and said sing the alto part, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They have no idea what that is. And so things went along with the hymn books for a while, and then we began to discover that since people didn't know how to read the music anyway, and all they did was just sing the melody, then we did away with the hymn books. Now you got the words on a screen, because that's all you need is just the words, because nobody knows music anyway, and nobody cares. I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and I asked him if he had ever been in a group of like 300 people all singing 4-part harmony. If you've never been in that situation, you have no idea what music is, because it sends chills literally down your spine. With the school that the kids went to, we got 2 hours a day of that every day, 5 days a week for 2 weeks, and we went to 2 years of that. Even the last time we were in Alabama, where we went to a convention where this was happening, just hearing it just literally sends chills down your back. It's just beautiful, awesome music. So by and large in the church, what we got today is a situation of, if you don't know what you're missing, it won't hurt you. And the interesting thing here is that when you look at modern day performers, not necessarily Christian, even in the world, and I'm thinking we were listening to an interview, I believe it was Prince. Prince is classically trained. Now that's not what he sings, but he's classically trained. He knows classical music. He can play classical music. He knows theory. And on the interview where we were listening, Prince was really getting on people in the music industry who don't know music. His basic opinion was, and I've never listened to Prince. His music isn't the kind of stuff I want to do, but you wouldn't think that this guy is a guy who's a real musician. He really knows music. And he got on them because on a number of levels, he was just tearing them up, and he's talking about people in the industry that he's in. But one of the things that he was pointing out that's very interesting is that all the people who are in the music industry who really enjoy their craft and are good at their craft are all classically trained with a heavy emphasis in theory. The ones who come in who aren't end up being flashes in the pan. They come in, they do their thing, but people tire of it very quickly because it's not quality. It doesn't have lasting quality. The people who have the lasting quality, by and large, are the people who are classically trained with a heavy emphasis in theory. Not in every case, but that's where it's at. So if you want your children to be able to really appreciate music and really be able to get into music, whether they do it professionally or whether they just listen to it for their own enjoyment, what I would suggest you do is train them classically with a heavy emphasis in theory. You say, well, what instrument? Well, if you're going to train them with classical music, which classical music is, by the way, the type of music that all our Western music come from. All our Western music, be it gospel to rock to pop, you name it, it all comes from classical. So if you want your children to be able to appreciate music and understand music, you need to make sure they're classically trained, heavy emphasis in theory. What instrument? What instrument do you think? When you think classical music, what instrument comes to mind? It was piano. You don't start your kids with any of these other instruments. You start them with piano. The problem with the other instruments is they just don't lend themselves as well to really understanding the theory that goes on in it, especially if you're learning classical music. One of the things about classical music is it has to be played exactly the way it was written. If you change one note, take a piece by Mozart, and you change one note, it's no longer a piece of Mozart. It's yours. It's not Mozart anymore. I was watching Megan get a lesson from her teacher, who's a very good pianist. And I was sitting there listening, and I thought it was great. And when it was all over, the teacher obviously thought it was pretty good too, because she starts praising her and she goes, Megan, that was awesome. That was just a beautiful piece. It was just wonderful. Your arrangement? In other words, it was yours. That's not what the author wrote. That's not what Mozart or Beethoven or whatever she was doing. That's not what they wrote. And we're not here to learn how to do your stuff. We're here to learn how to do their stuff. That's what it takes to be able to understand and appreciate music, so that when you hear it, you really can get into it. And I think it's very, very important for our children to grow up and be able to do that. So the point is, it's classical and then heavy theory. Once they know that, they can do like our kids. All our kids are taking up other instruments like guitar and flute and you name it. But do you think they're having a lot of difficulty picking up those second instruments? Sam took the flute and taught herself. She'd be better if she just worked at it more. But she was able to teach herself. Why? Because she already has all the basics. All the basics are already there. Now you can just start slapping on the other instruments as you go. And your children will end up really appreciating music. That's just my humble opinion, for whatever it's worth. Here's something you're going to run into with kids. When you start doing it the right way, especially if you start getting into areas of music or sports or the non-academic stuff, you start running into this thing called competition. And so I wanted to say a little word about this because you'll get into it. Competition, I believe, is very good. It's good to have competition. It drives me nuts when I was working for the school district, and I'd go to these field day, and everybody gets a ribbon because everybody's a winner. I'm sorry. Only one person crossed the line first. That was the winner. Now, you can call those other people, those other 150 kids, anything you want, but you can't call them a winner. If you've been watching the Olympics, how many people are on that podium? It's gold, silver, and bronze, right? Now, I don't know what you want to call those other people, but they ain't winners, all right? I'm sorry. Now, again, this is my humble opinion, all right? So competition is good, and you can only have one winner, one second place, one third place, and that's it. I'm sorry, and if you don't think that's the way it works, just watch the Olympics. You'll get a pretty good picture of what competition is all about. One of the things that you notice, I have really seen during this Olympics, because they're showing a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff. We're watching American Idol with our kids, and you see it there too. These people are, competing for a pretty big pot at the end, whether it be a silver medal or a gold medal or a bronze medal, or whether it be that recording contract that sits at the end of American Idol. Do you think these people are big on competition? Oh, yeah. But it's amazing how friendly it is. It's amazing how friendly it is. These people aren't fighting each other. One of them goes out there and just kicks another person all over the slopes or all over the ice or whatever, and then they all get together and they go out to a restaurant that night and have a good time as if nothing happened. It's all kept very friendly. Competition doesn't have to be cutthroat. Here's where competition gets cutthroat. And we have seen this. Edie and I have run into families just within the last year where we've seen this ugly little thing rear its ugly head. It's the parents. The kids, the young people, Who do you got competing in the Olympics? Basically young people. Who do you have in American Idol? Young people. They got some 16-year-olds in there. These young people don't have animosity towards one another, but what do you got? You got parents at Little League games pulling out guns and shooting the other parent. Now, that's unhealthy competition, and that's where it starts getting unfriendly. And you now have parents who now begin to have their kids wanting their kids to be better because they want their kids to be better than the other guy's kids. Now, you understand those children don't see it that way? This is a parental thing. And so now what you have competition between parents that is usually not friendly, and it results in children being forced to do something just because the parent can't stand the thought of somebody else's child being better than their child. And if you guys haven't seen that somewhere along the road already, open your eyes, it's out there. And it's like, my kid is better than that person's kid. Competition that results from doing something just because a sibling or another child is doing it is not good. Boy, we have to watch that with our kids. Well, she's getting more attention at the concerts than I get. Well, so what? Now, they start getting into this as they start getting older. All of a sudden, this competition starts taking on this adult level stuff, and it's not good. So as a parent, you need to get over it. Your child doesn't have to be as good as another child. Just get over it. If you have more than one child and you begin to see this competition going on between them, stop it, okay, as best you can. It won't be easy. We fight it all the time. Understand that your child doesn't have to be the best at everything. And let me give you something that may help you accept that. God rarely uses the best. So why would you want your child to be the best? That's not the kind of person God typically uses. We read the verse where we talked about the kind of things God likes, right? God doesn't want the best, he wants the submitted. If you want to give your child something to strive for, try and get them to submit. And we talked about the call of God and all that. Teach them how to be the best at submission. Forget all the rest of the stuff. They don't have to be the best. Chances are, if they're the best, they're useless to God anyway. Now, why would that be? We already talked about that. Just being human. What happens if I'm the best? I am the best. Do you understand it's not as easy for me to submit to the call of God on my life for the right reason? God may call me and I may submit, but what's my motive? Yeah, I want people to notice me. Wrong reason to be submitting to the call of God, even if he has called you. Wrong reason. That's why God rarely uses the best, because the best tend to have this pride issue that they have to deal with all the time, and it gets in the way, and God just can't use them. So as a parent, why would you want your child to be the very best just for being best? If your goal is to have them to be used by God, then that's counterproductive, isn't it? Now, do we want our kids to strive to be the best and to be good? Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's anything wrong with having that goal. But that is not going to be the primary issue. You understand? Now, real quick, I want to talk about IQ. This is primarily if you have kids that are under the age of 5, or you know people have kids under the age of 5, and if your kids are older than that, just hang on. You're going to have grandkids that are going to be under the age of 5, and you're going to be able to make them very smart. IQ is basically a measure of the percentile range of where you fall as a percentage of the other people. My IQ basically puts me at about the 98.6th percentile. Now, what that means is that 98.6% of the population is not as smart as me. Doesn't that make me brilliant? That basically means my IQ is somewhere between 135 and 140. What's it take to get a kid to that level? Okay, first of all, usually if you have a high IQ like that, it is the firstborn. Does it surprise you that I am the firstborn of 5? The firstborn is typically the smartest. They have the highest IQ. IQs of 135, 140, 145 are very common amongst firstborn. I'm not unique in that area. A lot of firstborns operate at that level. Why is that? There is actually a reason for why that happens. Do you want your child to have a very high IQ? One of the best things you can do is eliminate the word babysitter from your vocabulary. What happens when a mom and a dad, brand new mom and dad, they have their first baby? What do? They take that kid everywhere with them. Everywhere. Oh, look it. They want to be seen with little Johnny, little Susie, and so that child goes everywhere with them. Babysitters? Never heard of them. Nurseries? Oh, no. No. You don't leave that little newborn in the nursery. You take that little newborn into service, and you may have to leave if it cries, but you're not leaving it in the nursery. Now, folks, all you got to do is look around this morning in service. Find your newborns, the first newborn, the first one. Now, what happens when number 2 comes along? Well, number 1 is about 2 years old, and mom is like, well, let's put it this way. We're like little kids. You ever notice with your kids, you get them toys, they play with them, and then guess what? We say what? The new wears off. That's the way we are with our kids. By the time number 2 comes along, the news wore off. We're not nearly as excited about taking that one around and showing them to everybody. And so where does the kid end up? Along with their 2-year-old brother or sister. With the babysitter, in the nursery. Now, in the brain, you have dendrites. And you have what's called a myelin sheath that gets developed around those dendrites. The thicker the myelin sheath, it's like a wire. You have to take my word for this, but in electronics, the bigger around the wire, the less resistance it has to electricity. So the bigger around your dendrites, the easier they conduct the electrical impulses of the brain, and the smarter you are and the higher your IQ. So what makes the dendrites grow? It's what's called the myelin sheath. It's made out of fat, and what causes it to grow, what creates the chemical reaction that makes those things grow, are new experiences during the first 2 years of life. Whenever that child sees or hears something or touches something or senses something that they have never seen or heard or touched before, it creates a situation where that fat deposits itself around that myelin sheath and it gets bigger. So when they are constantly looking at the same babysitter's face, that doesn't do it. It's when they're going to the restaurants and all that. So if you want your kids to be smart, what do? Leave the babysitters alone, take the kid to the restaurant with you, and make sure you never go to the same restaurant twice. Go to different places. Take that little 1- and 2-year-old to the museum, to the zoo. You say, what if they fall asleep halfway through the first floor? Leave, come back another time, and do the second half of the first floor. You know, the museum's good for about 8 or 9 trips if you do that with a little newborn. But get them to see things. Take them out to Centennial Airport and let them watch the airplanes one day. You say, but they're not interested in it. It doesn't matter. It's new stuff. It's stimulus. It makes that myelin sheath grow. New things. And when number 2 comes along, what do? Same thing you did with the first one. Oh, it's a lot more work now because you got 2, and then you got 3, and then you got 4. Oh, yeah. Take them everywhere with you. Show them up. Do it because it's developing the brain. It's during the first 2 years. Let me read one last thing for you. It has to do with fat. Fat is what produces the myelin sheath. This is a direct quote. I'm just going to read what I got on the internet. Feed your brain the right fats. Talks about the first 2 years being a crucial time for that. And it talks about feeding baby brains. The most rapid brain growth occurs during the first year of life, with the infant's brain tripling in size by the first birthday. Where's that all coming from? Myelin sheath stuff. It's gray, by the way. That's why we call it gray matter. During this stage of rapid central nervous system growth, the brain uses 60% of the total energy consumed by the infant. That's why they sleep all the time. And the brain itself is 60% fat. Fats are major components of brain cell membrane and the myelin sheath around each nerve, so it makes sense that getting enough fat and the right kinds of fat can greatly affect brain development and performance. In fact, during the first year, around 50% of an infant's daily calories come from fat. Now, they say Mother Nature here, but we know that's God. It says Mother Nature knows how important fat is for babies. She provides around 50% of the calories in mother's milk as fat. So where does the fat come from? From the mother's milk. if a mother is breastfeeding and treating that child like a firstborn, taking them everywhere, and see and do every opportunity she gets, she is going to produce the necessary stimulus to make the myelin sheath grow. She'll be providing that baby the fat necessary for it to grow. And what do you end up with? A child with a very high IQ. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the benefits of that are next week.